Jeffrey.
Para este podcast solamente hablamos en español.
Oh, okay. You're going to be doing that mostly on your own.
Oh,
I need to practice my Spanish. When I was in an undergrad, I took the placement test, and I tested out of 16 hours of college Spanish, so I never had to take it at the college level.
Did they actually talk to you in Spanish at all and say, can you actually understand?
Well, it's one of those tests where I was in a massive auditorium, and it was like there's a written part, and then there's an audio part, and the audio part is being played over loudspeakers, and they're only coming out of one side of the room, and it's like, and it's like, somehow I managed to test out of 16 hours of Spanish on this test. And so I felt like I didn't get to cultivate it very much. So I can read it very well, and I can speak it okay, but it's like it's not automatic. It doesn't like instantly turn on. Now, if I'm at a restaurant and I'm ordering food, then it's easier.
Yeah.
But I just I don't. It's not a muscle I get to exercise.
Right.
Much.
No, my favorite thing is speaking the very, very little Spanish that I do, and then people get all excited and speak to me in Spanish. I'm like, no comprendo.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so that's me. Anyway, but interestingly, right, so I think we've established now I speak more Spanish than you, yet you're working on an Israeli TV show.
Possibly.
So can you explain, how is it that I wrote, I was one of the writers on I'll Be Home for Christmas, and you're somehow working in Israel?
I mean,
I don't know who did. Well, I guess this is just payback. I did cultural appropriation first. Is that how you're playing this? Wow, you're vindictive.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's a global market these days, and so you have to diversify, and you have to look for opportunities where you can find them, and it's just like an opportunity opened, and hopefully is opening other opportunities and other doors over there. So I'm excited about that.
That's cool. And can you talk about the show at all?
So this is very early stages, but I was developing a project with a company called Imagery. They're under part of Fremantle Media.
Okay.
And with writing producer partners Michael Aloni, who's very well-known actor, especially in Israel, star of Shtisel. It was a big hit here and globally.
Shocking
Netflix.
Big hit.
Shocking big hit, very shocking big hit. An incredible person, great actor. And Michael Mayer, who is here lives here in Los Angeles, but is originally from Haifa. And he and Michael Aloni had worked together a couple of times on Michael's films. Michael, Out in the Dark, and then a film that he did about a year ago called Happy Times. And I came on board a project that they were developing with Álvaro Rodríguez that was kind of a period espionage thriller kind of story that I think is really, really, really cool. And we kind of developed it out and had some meetings about it. And it's kind of opened up other opportunities for some different projects that we were developing. And so...
Like also in Israel?
Oh, yeah, also in Israel. So, yeah, I mean, one of the projects that hopefully I'm about to head out to Tel Aviv in a couple of weeks to take some meetings on. This is all very preliminary, but is a project that I had developed initially as a feature many years ago, and then kind of came back to it, tried to reconfigure it as a pilot, but with just even the concept of like, oh, what if this were set in Tel Aviv? What if this was set in Israel? Just like open up the floodgates, and kind of a lot of new ideas came about. And so I'm excited about the possibilities of exploring that. And
it sounds amazing. Have you ever asked Michael Aloni, like, to what do they attribute the success of Shtisel, like outside of Israel? And just as a little backup, like for people who've maybe don't know Shtisel. I don't know if it's still streaming on Netflix. It was for a while.
I believe so, but
I'm
not sure.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Yeah. Anyway, it's a kind of 2 or 3 seasons of a ultra-Orthodox Jewish family living in, I think, Bnei Brak or Jerusalem in Israel. And it like made for, 3 cents per episode. And I think the first shocker for everybody was that the first of all, the religious in Israel don't own televisions, so you're already going.
Right.
It's like, I think I'm going to, I don't know, put out, give singing lessons to the tone deaf. It's like, so they clearly weren't making it for the ultra religious audience, but there's a lot of, sort of modern Orthodox also in Israel.
Right.
So maybe they're doing that. But it was the secular Israelis who generally, not to get into the politics of the religious and
Right.
the secular in Israel, but it's a bit of a kind of a frenemy kind of situation going on there.
Yeah.
The fact that they embraced it so much, and Shtisel is this odd thing that it's not more critical of the ultra-Orthodox than it is of anybody, and it's not an unfair representation of the community. So it's like, there's a lot of shows that will come out, that deals with the ultra-Orthodox, and it's all generally often very negative.
Right.
This was not negative. This was just, they're people with problems just like the rest of us. So somehow that caught on in Israel. So, but as Michael Aloni ever said, well, yeah, okay, I kind of get it because we live there. Why did it catch on in America and in other countries?
I don't know. We've talked about it a little bit, but I think it goes back to what you just said. It's like, these are people with problems like everybody else. Mm-hmm. And there's an element of that I think is very powerful. I remember having this conversation with Allison Anders once where she was talking about Mi Vida Loca, the film that she made here about East LA homegirls in the 90s, and how she had gone to some Indian reservation somewhere in the Southwest and was told, like, every household here has a VHS copy of Mi Vida Loca. And it was surprising to her. And it's like, how does this cross over to something where these people have, this community may not have anything directly in common, but it's like shows, and when you're, doing these creative things and you're doing them in a way that is, that expresses empathy, that expresses, like, it's not putting people in boxes. It's actually kind of like exploring the universal truths about our human existence. Mm-hmm. Then that crosses over. And then the more specific it is in that cultural context, the more universal it feels. When I did this animated series that I was co-creator of for Netflix, Seis Manos, in that first meeting with Netflix, they were like, don't try to appeal to, like, how are we going to get this demographic or that demographic, mm-hmm. and what can we put in here to find a 15-year-old, boys from Peoria or whatever the thing is, right?
The target demographic, 15-year-old boys in Peoria.
15-year-old boys in Peoria. Well, the Netflix algorithm, I'm sure.
Right.
But they were like, the more specific it is to itself, the more universal it will be.
Right.
And it's like, I think that's good advice. And,
right.
and I think that's, when you find something that that people just relate to, even though there's a difference in the sort of veneer, the sort of, cultural text, the subtext is all,
right.
The panoply of human experience and emotion. And it also goes back to the thing of, like, as a younger writer, I used to always rankle at the idea when people would say, write what you know. I had a friend of mine was a very successful novelist, and I guess it still is. And he was teaching writing, and he said, you're from Wyoming, not to me, but he was talking about a student. He's like, you're from Wyoming, write me a Wyoming story. And I always thought, like, write what you know. I mean, it's like, what do I know? I don't know anything. I've got to invent stuff. But then I realized, like, write what you know means write what you know emotionally.
Right, I was going to say, it's code for write what you feel.
Write what you feel, exactly.
Yeah.
Very much so. And it's like, everybody knows what it's like to, be rejected. Everybody knows what it's like to lose a loved one.
Not me, baby.
Well, the rest of us,
yeah, okay.
And so there's something where it's like, tapping into that makes it, that's the thing that people connect with. And and all this other detail is what gives it that verisimilitude, that, that feeling like, oh, this is true. There's truth in this. Even though it's alien to my physical experience, it's not to my emotional experience.
Right. Yeah, that, and write what you know was actually good advice I was given by my manager, oh my God, 30 years ago.
Yeah.
That's how long I've been with my manager. Because it was like, I think the first script I wrote was like some slasher horror thing.
Right.
That almost got made. It was kind of the proverbial everything was almost got made. But maybe the third or fourth one was, I was just kind of doing, I don't want to say grindhouse stuff, but, it was kind of like in that sort of zone.
Yeah.
And then he said, look, the writing is fine, but why don't you write something that meaning, feel emotionally.
Yeah.
So I wrote a piece called Dear Mr. Turner, which was about a young man who has to go to the upstate New York, where his grandfather has kind of gone off the grid. Because I was very close to my grandfather, who bought a house in upstate New York. He didn't go off the grid, but I kind of spun that my relationship with my grandfather, who I adored, into this story about the adored grandfather who seems like either he's crazy or he's brilliant now, and we can't figure it out.
Yeah.
So 16 years later, it got made as a Hallmark Channel movie, but that was the thing that got me my agent, made my manager like, yeah, we should produce this. So they tried producing, I can't argue with that.
No, it is good advice.
Yeah.
There's a lot to that, and I think it's served me well over the years to go back to that idea of just like write what you feel.
Right. Well, and if you feel vampires biting your neck, we have From Dusk Till Dawn.
Yeah, well, I mean, even that's like, to me, one of the fun things about doing something like that is, like you said, it's kind of grindhousey and all that other stuff. But years ago, I saw this documentary that Martin Scorsese did called A Journey Through American Cinema. And he has this whole section in there about the director as smuggler, and how all these filmmakers, these auteurs like Orson Welles or whoever would, smuggle so much of themselves into the story, or smuggle things that they cared about, and into a story that might otherwise not have had those elements, smuggling the personal. And so there's a lot of smuggled stuff and the possibilities in doing a story about, vampires and south of the border stuff. And for example, one of the things I was really intrigued by, and I think this is the first season of the series, we had a new character that's not in the film. Obviously the show is based on a film that Quentin Tarantino wrote and Robert Rodriguez directed, and starred George Clooney, and kind of helped kick off his film career and all that stuff. And but we had, in developing the TV series, you're now trying to turn this 100-minute movie into 10 episodes of TV and then more, right? So obviously it's something where you're blowing out the world and you're expanding things. And so we created this new character, a Texas Ranger who's half Mexican. And in the history of the Texas Rangers, there's a lot of violence towards Mexicans and towards Mexican Americans. I mean, it's a pretty bloody history that goes back decades and decades. And so I was very interested about the idea of someone who is of that, background, putting on a badge and acting in that, for lack of a better word, in that costume. Right. And there's a scene where...
Were they antagonistic towards the Mexican characters or Mexican Americans?
No, and he has a mentor character who in the film was played by Michael Parks, and in the show was played by Don Johnson, Texas Ranger Earl McGraw, who shows up in a few other of Quentin's movies. And so, but there's something it's like in the first episode, smuggled in this whole thing where he's trying to ask Earl to baptize his kid, and that's kind of a little bit of a thing. But then, so kind of leaning into some of the elements of Catholicism in the Mexican American community, or at least religion, and the importance of family and things like that, and how this mentor character is telling him, you have to be, you have one responsibility, and it's to this job more than that. But there's this sequence where by the time the Gecko brothers, who are in the show, are played by DJ Gatrona and Zane Holtz, two really fun and great actors to work with, they're on the run after having robbed a bank, and they're trying to get across the border to Mexico. And this Texas Ranger, Freddie, is after them. By the time he gets to the border, he's kind of run afoul of his own keepers or whatever, of his own bosses. And so when he gets to the border, he cannot cross at the regular border crossing. He's already kind of a little bit of a wanted man. And so he strips down to his underwear and crosses the river holding his uniform, going across the border to the other side. And I loved that image. I had this image in my head. I don't know exactly what it means, but there's something about subverting the idea of, you always see, the immigrant coming across to the Texas side of the border, across the river, in their underwear, holding their clothes up inside. And there was just something interesting to me about like that liminal space of stripping down to nothing and crossing over. And then when he gets to the other side, kind of the camera pans down and we see that he's left his ranger badge on the Texas side of the border. And it's
Right.
like, this is a new thing. This is like, all bets are off kind of thing. And so, all of these elements, I think are
Right.
just as
Well, that's a classic
interesting.
like rebirth kind of
It's a classic,
metaphor.
yeah,
through
absolutely.
water, you come out, you're a different person.
Absolutely, 100%. And
Yeah.
so that's kind of stuff that's like, as much as the mythology and the vampire stuff and all of that interests me, I always like thinking about
Right.
story in that way too, and opportunities that doing something, that some people might dismiss, and maybe rightly so, as schlocky, whatever, but you smuggle, and
I love that term. I hadn't heard that. That you smuggle yourself with it. Yeah, it's a nice metaphor.
Yeah, I mean, it's like I think it's kind of it's been. I think that may have been the introduction to me for that idea of smuggling, and it's like, okay, that's what you do. That's what you do as a writer, because there's something that otherwise everything is going to it's too nakedly personal. Otherwise, you've got to smuggle it in.
Right.